It's high time that we awake from our sleep.
The scripture says, prepare to meet thy God. Are you prepared?
If you don't stand for something, then you will fall for anything.
All right, guys, welcome in again for Taking a Stand, a podcast that's based on getting the truth out there and just making sure that we are speaking about the issues of our day. Today, I wanted to talk to you a little bit about basically birth control and in vitro fertilization and things like that. I get a lot of questions as a pastor about these things. And since we've been talking about abortion recently and we're studying through the book of Genesis and we're talking about the sanctity of human life, this kind of goes hand in hand with that. Of course, we understand, listening to the podcast from last week about abortion and what it is and what the biblical data about it is, what our perspective is. Abortion, of course, is not an option for any believer. The exception for that would be the ectopic pregnancy, which is when the baby is being formed in the fallopian tube and putting the life of the mother at risk. And of course, in very, very small percentage of instances, we would, of course, any doctor is going to say, yeah, we need to end that pregnancy in order to preserve the life of the mother. And we understand that. But apart from that, abortion is just not an option for a believer, for the Christian. And so today we want to talk a little bit about this because I get asked questions about this a lot of times is, what about these other areas of our lives as Christians? How do we deal with them? What's the ethic? What's the biblical worldview when it comes to these things? So let's talk about birth control first. And here's what we should know. If you're using birth control as a married couple between a husband and a wife, it's not disobedient to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. And let me back up and just say that everything that we're dealing with when we talk about the sanctity of life, we always want to come back to Scripture. Genesis 1:27 is the foundational verse for the sanctity of human life. It says, "So God created man in his own image. In the image of God he created him. Male and female he created them." Now, in the next verse, God blesses them, and he says something here. He says, "Then God blessed them and God said to them, be fruitful and multiply." And I want to pause right there and just say, there is a big may you that is implied before we say those words, be fruitful and multiply. So we could say, God said to them, may you be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, and over every living thing that moves on the earth. And so God meant this to be a blessing, not an imperative command. Now, I will say this, when you study this verse in the Hebrew, it is written in the imperative, but you have to take the entire context here, and you have to understand that it says that God blessed them and he said to them. And so although God is giving a command, he's doing it in a way that he's expressing a strong desire for the human beings that they would be fruitful and they would multiply. If this was a command here, then guys, I hate to say this, but if you're a married couple, you would be forced to try and to have as many children as was physically possible during your lifetime. Otherwise, you would be being disobedient. But that's not the way God sees this. God sees families as a great source of happiness and blessing, not as an obligation for every single person. How do we know this? Well, we take the Bible within its full context. And of course, we understand the Apostle Paul was a man who may have been at one time married, but was serving the Lord in his singleness by the time we come across his life. And he was a man who wrote 12 of the books of the New Testament. And some people say 13, right? But in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verse 17, Paul says, "Nevertheless, each person should live as a believer in whatever situation the Lord has assigned to them, just as God has called them. This is the rule I lay down in all the churches." Now, that's coming from a single man who did not feel obligated to get married and have as many kids as he possibly could, because he didn't interpret Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. as an imperative command for all Christians. So we need to be careful. So what I'm trying to say then is that birth control is not being disobedient to Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Secondly, I want to make the point that birth control is not intrinsically evil in and of itself. There are some churches that teach that if you are taking birth control, it's intrinsically evil. But these churches that say this are actually contradicting themselves, because they do tell you to use the natural planning cycle, which they do endorse. But using their logic, if birth control is evil, then the natural planning cycle is evil too. And so you shouldn't be using that either, but it's a contradiction there. A third point that I would make about birth control is that procreation is not the only purpose that God intended for sexual intimacy within a marriage relationship. So procreation is not the only purpose of sexual intimacy. God does say it is for procreation in Genesis 1:28, but it's also for unification. According to Matthew chapter 19, verse 5, the two become one flesh. And it's also for recreation. If any of you have ever read the Song of Solomon, you know that, but I don't want to get into that too much today. A fourth point I do want to make about birth control here today is that anything that destroys a fertilized ovum is considered sin, because again, we believe in the sanctity of human life. So if you have an egg that's been fertilized by sperm and then it is destroyed, that is basically taking the life of the baby, a person with a soul. If you go back to our last episode, we talked about when does the Bible recognize life? It begins from the moment of conception. It's all the way through the time in the womb to the point of birth, and then, of course, from birth all the way through death. So that is when the Bible recognizes life. And so this would mean that the Plan B or the morning after pill, that would be wrong to take for the believer, for the Christian. It is sin. And not just for us, it's sin for anybody to take human life in that way. There are forms of birth control that basically thicken the walls of the uterus, and they prevent a fertilized egg from being fed. That would basically be wrong. That would be something that is ethically wrong for the believer to take. For example, if it has drospirenone is a drug that comes in a lot of these birth controls. And it causes the wall of the uterus to be thickened and prevents that fertilized egg from attaching. And so therefore that would be off limits for a Christian. It would be something that ethically would be wrong for us to be using. Another thing that I get questions about is IUDs. IUDs are also not an option for Christians because they basically kill the baby by scraping that forming embryo off of the uterus walls. And that could be, and they can also cause problems and be dangerous for fallopian tubes as well, just from a health standpoint. So anything else that prevents contraception without harming either spouse, though, this would be acceptable in the Christian worldview. So let me repeat that. Anything that would prevent conception without harming either spouse, this is the ethically correct form for us as believers. So I will say this, natural family planning is a great thing, and it's probably always the best, but there are other things out there that can be used as well. And I'm not going to get into all those things right now. Just do your homework. You have to do your own research on that. But it's a good idea to just pray, seek the Lord for wisdom, and make a decision together with your married partner on that, your husband, your wife. All right. When we get further than birth control, I want to say a few things first. First of all, once you get outside of God's plan for a husband and a wife and the children that they have as a natural part of a family, anytime that you get outside of that basic plan that God has given us, things are going to get the lines are going to become ethically blurred, and it's going to become very complicated. And I'll admit there are situations that I am not even prepared or qualified to tackle and to try to get into the ethics of them and to understand what's right and what's wrong, biblically speaking. So here's what I would encourage couples. If you do find yourself in a situation where it is difficult for you to have children, then the first thing that you should do is pray and seek the Lord, obviously. And you probably already know that. But I would also say this: adoption should be considered seriously at that point. It's something that you should just realize and recognize, man, God could really use you as a couple to change the lives of children that he brings to you through adoption. But you've got to ask yourself at this point, what are your motives? What are your motives? You don't want to have wrong motives when you go into seeking to have children outside of that natural process, because anytime that you do, you got to know it's going to be complicated. It's going to complicate things. So you want to know what God is wanting you to do. You want to have a sense of peace from the Lord about whichever situation you go into from there. Now, I want to talk about in vitro fertilization with you guys today. First of all, a question I get, is this okay for Christian couples to seek out? And I would say, well, the Bible really doesn't speak to this issue. Therefore, we kind of have to treat this as a gray area. And this becomes a matter of each individual being led by the Holy Spirit in your specific situation. And so again, I would encourage you as a married couple to be in prayer and to be seeking the Lord. However, one thing that you should always remember is that God values every single human life, even fertilized eggs. And that should be considered if you're planning to use this method. So a few guidelines that I would give as a pastor for those of you that may be seeking in vitro fertilization, after you've prayed about it, after you both have a peace about it from the Lord, and you're sure that this is what the Lord wants you to do. Again, number one, I would ask you to consider adoption. There are so many children out there today that would benefit from being raised in a godly home. And so pray about considering that God might send you some of those children. But secondly, again, I would encourage you that first you need to understand your motives. James chapter 3, verses 13 through 17 is a great filter for you as a married couple to read through and pray through to test what your motives are before you make a decision to pursue in vitro fertilization. And then thirdly, I would say that for the Christian, from an ethical standpoint, you should harvest only the eggs that you will implant. Let me say that again. You should harvest only the eggs that you will implant in the womb. Every fertilized egg must be implanted in the womb. If they don't fully develop, then that's part of a natural process of miscarriage. That's not intentional destruction. There is a difference. However, it is sin. It is wrong to destroy any fertilized eggs. And this is where a lot of Christians are confused and they don't understand that. This is something you'll have to sit down with the person, the doctor that you're planning this whole process with, and you're going to have to be very clear on this because they're going to push you, they're going to pressure you to obviously get the most eggs that you can for your money. And they're going to try to force this on you, and they're going to tell you all kinds of statistics and things like that. But you have to understand that, listen, you need to go into this with the mindset that, hey, if we're going to pursue this, we are going to implant every fertilized egg. And therefore, we may need to do some things differently. We may need to ask that doctor that, hey, we only want 3 fertilized eggs or 4 fertilized eggs, and we're going to plant all of them in the womb. And well, then you have to take into all these other considerations of is this healthy for the mother and all of these kinds of things. But that might lead to additional attempts and additional costs. But that is the only ethical approach for a Christian who is seeking to please God and not commit sin in this area. So fourthly, I would tell you to be very careful and prayerful about entering into the in vitro fertilization process, because once again, the further you get from God's natural plan of a man and a woman in a marriage producing children in a natural way, you are blurring the lines and complicating things. It can become very complicated, and so I just encourage you to be very careful and prayerful about entering into that in vitro fertilization process, because you have to remember, listen, it's not just your happiness that's at stake here. It's also the lives of all of those embryos that are formed through this process. And you know what? I got to be honest, today in America, we have a problem in this area. And it's not just in America, it's all over the world. But at these hospitals, guys, there are literally millions of either frozen embryos or embryos that are just on hold. Human beings, persons with souls, and they're there, and yet they have many of them are just going to be destroyed, and it grieves the heart of God because remember, life is sacred, and from the moment of conception, that is a life that is recognized by God, and so we have a great responsibility in this. One last thing as I close out the podcast that I get asked about quite often, and it's about screening ethics. When it comes to prenatal screening, what's okay for the Christian and what's not? I would say that anything for sex detection, of course, that's fine. If you want to find out what's the sex of the baby, is it a boy or a girl? That's great. Sex selection? No way. If your motive in going into this is like, hey, if it's a boy, we're going to keep it, a girl, we're not, that's absolutely sinful. Every life matters to God. So sex selection, no way. What about bioscreening for diseases that can be cured or alleviated in the womb? Yes, there's nothing wrong with that. My wife and I did that for the babies when that became available, and they asked us, do you want to do bioscreening? We did that for the purpose of if they were able to detect something that they could treat while the baby was still in the womb, we thought that would be a great idea. So anything that's for life and to save life is fine. Bioscreening for the purpose of determining whether or not you keep that baby? No way. That's ethically off limits for the Christian. And so with that, guys, I just thought I would have this podcast to hopefully maybe answer some of those questions. Hopefully I didn't create more questions than I actually answered here. But if you do have questions, I would encourage you to schedule an appointment with your pastor and come in and talk about that, just so that you can hear, hey, from a biblical perspective, from a biblical worldview, as a believer, I want to please the Lord. How do I do that in this situation? It's such a good thing to do. So thanks for listening, guys, and I hope and pray you guys have a great week. You've been listening to Taking a Stand with Pastor Phil McKay. If you enjoy the podcast, please subscribe, like, and share. Also, you can follow us on social media, and for more content, visit calvaryreno.org/takingastand. Visit calvaryreno.org to learn more about our church. And if you have a question, please email it to info@calvarychapelreno.org. And remember, if you don't stand for something, you will fall for anything.